The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on April 22, 2024, shattering the quiet morning in Mason County, Ohio. A jogger had discovered a body at the edge of Sunset Lake, near a secluded cabin where Westridge University students had been celebrating a birthday weekend. What should have been a simple recovery operation would evolve into one of the most psychologically complex murder investigations in Ohio's history, a case that would expose the darkest corners of human nature and reveal how quickly love can transform into deadly obsession. The victim was Chelsea Clarke, a brilliant 22-year-old black law student with a 3.9 GPA and dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. She was found in the dense forest behind the cabin, her body bearing evidence of a violent struggle that painted a horrifying picture of her final moments. Blood trails led from the cabin's back porch deep into the woods, suggesting she had been chased, hunted like an animal by someone she trusted. But this wasn't a random act of violence committed by a stranger lurking in the shadows. This was something far more sinister, something that would expose the twisted psychology of love turned to hatred and the deadly power of secrets kept in the wrong hands.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
What made this case immediately suspicious wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but the behavior of the witnesses. 23 black students from Westridge University's elite academic programs had been present at the cabin that weekend, representing some of Ohio's brightest young minds, future doctors, lawyers, business leaders, and politicians. These weren't troubled kids from broken homes or individuals with criminal histories. Yet when investigators arrived, every single one of them claimed the same thing. They couldn't remember what happened the night Chelsea died. The collective amnesia was suspicious enough on its own, but what made it truly chilling was the psychological state of these witnesses. Hollow-eyed, traumatized, sitting in stunned silence like survivors of a war zone, they exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma that went far beyond typical drunken memory loss. Whatever had happened in those woods wasn't just murder. It was something so psychologically devastating that 23 people's minds had essentially shut down to protect them from the memory. But as investigators would soon discover, their claimed amnesia wasn't trauma-induced memory loss at all. It was a carefully coordinated lie designed to protect themselves from the consequences of their own actions. Chelsea Clarke's story begins not with her death, but with her remarkable life and the courage it took to live authentically in a world that often punishes difference with violence. Born in a small black community outside Columbus, Chelsea had known from an early age that she was different, that the body she inhabited didn't match the person she knew herself to be. Her journey to living as her authentic self had been long and difficult, marked by family rejection, social isolation, and the constant fear that comes with being a black transgender woman in a society that often views trans existence as controversial rather than simply human. But Chelsea was a fighter, someone who refused to let other people's prejudices define her possibilities. She had transitioned during her senior year of high school, finding the courage to live as herself despite the social costs. When she arrived at Westridge University 3 years later, she made the conscious decision to live stealth, presenting as a cisgender woman and keeping her transgender identity private, except to a select few trusted friends. This wasn't about shame or denial of who she was, but about survival and the recognition that in many spaces, her safety depended on others not knowing her full history. At Westridge, Chelsea had found something she'd never experienced before: acceptance, respect, and the opportunity to be judged solely on her intellect and character rather than her gender identity. She thrived in the law program, particularly in constitutional law courses where her lived experience with discrimination gave her insights that amazed her professors. She was passionate about civil rights law, seeing it as a way to protect others who faced the kind of systemic discrimination she had experienced. Her professors described her as one of the most gifted legal minds they'd ever encountered, someone who could analyze complex constitutional issues with surgical precision while never losing sight of the human impact of legal decisions. But perhaps most importantly, at Westridge, Chelsea had found love, or what she thought was love, with Clarke Densley, a charismatic 24-year-old black business major who seemed to represent everything she had once thought was impossible for someone like her. Clarke was everything Chelsea wasn't: Loud where she was quiet, aggressive where she was gentle, popular where she was reserved. He was student body president, captain of the debate team, and came from the kind of wealthy black family from Connecticut that produced senators and CEOs. He was also devastatingly handsome, intellectually gifted, and possessed the kind of magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. Their relationship had begun 8 months earlier in a constitutional law seminar they both attended as electives. Clarke had been immediately drawn to Chelsea's brilliant legal mind and her ability to challenge his arguments in ways that forced him to think more deeply about complex issues. For Chelsea, Clarke represented validation of her worth as a woman. Here was this incredibly desirable man, someone who could have anyone he wanted, and he had chosen her. Their intellectual connection had quickly evolved into something deeper, and for the first time in her life, Chelsea felt like she was living the kind of normal, happy relationship she had always dreamed of. But Clarke densely was harboring secrets of his own, secrets that would prove far more dangerous than anything Chelsea could have imagined. Beneath his charming exterior lurked a personality disorder that made him incapable of genuine empathy or love. What others saw as charisma was actually narcissistic manipulation, a carefully crafted persona designed to get him what he wanted from other people. His political ambitions weren't driven by a desire to serve others, but by a need for power and control that could never be satisfied. And his relationship with Chelsea, which he saw as love, he saw as ownership, complete control over another person who reflected well on his image and satisfied his ego. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, but they were subtle enough that Chelsea, desperate for love and acceptance, had rationalized them away. Clarke's need to know where she was at all times, which he framed as concern for her safety. His tendency to dominate conversations and dismiss her opinions when they disagreed, which he presented as intellectual passion. His habit of going through her belongings when she wasn't around, which he excused as natural curiosity about someone he cared about. Each red flag was accompanied by an explanation that seemed reasonable on the surface but was actually part of a pattern of controlling behavior that was gradually tightening like a noose around Chelsea's independence. Most disturbing of all was Clarke's obsession with Chelsea's past. His constant questions about her family, her childhood, her experiences before college. He claimed it was because he wanted to know everything about the woman he loved, but Chelsea's instincts told her there was something more predatory about his curiosity. She had become increasingly careful about what personal information she shared, instinctively understanding that knowledge in Clarke's hands could be weaponized if their relationship ever soured. But despite her caution, she had no idea that Clarke had been systematically investigating her background for months, driven by a paranoid need to control every aspect of their relationship.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The birthday celebration that would end in Chelsea's murder was organized by Madison Torres, a popular black psychology major who was turning 23 on April 20th. Madison had rented the lakeside cabin for the weekend, inviting her closest friends for what she described as the perfect getaway before final stress kicks in. The guest list read like a who's who of Westridge University's black elite, student government leaders, honor society members, debate team champions, and academic overachievers who saw themselves as the future leaders of Black America. The cabin itself was a sprawling, rustic structure that had been in Madison's family for generations, located on a pristine lake about 2 hours from campus. With multiple bedrooms, a large common area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a wraparound deck that offered stunning views of Sunset Lake. It was the kind of place where memories were made and friendships were strengthened. The setting was postcard perfect, dense forests surrounding crystal clear water, with hiking trails and swimming areas that promised a weekend of relaxation and fun away from the pressures of academic life. For Chelsea, the invitation represented something significant: acceptance into Madison's inner circle, validation that she belonged among Westridge's social elite. She had been hesitant to accept at first, knowing that large group settings could be unpredictable and that her relationship with Clarke sometimes became strained when he was performing for an audience. But Clarke had been enthusiastic about going, seeing it as an opportunity to reinforce his social status, and Chelsea had ultimately agreed, hoping that a romantic weekend away might help strengthen their relationship. The drive to the cabin on Friday afternoon, April 19th, started promisingly enough. Clarke was in an unusually good mood, talking excitedly about his post-graduation plans and how he saw Chelsea fitting into his future. He spoke about introducing her to his family during the upcoming summer break, about the possibility of her transferring to law school near wherever he ended up for graduate school, about building a life together that seemed almost too good to be true. For Chelsea, listening to the man she loved talk about their shared future felt like validation of every risk she had taken to live authentically. But there were troubling undercurrents even during this seemingly perfect drive. Clarke's comments about their future together were possessive rather than romantic, focusing more on how Chelsea would support his ambitions than on their mutual goals and dreams. When she mentioned her own career aspirations, particularly her passion for civil rights law, Clarke would quickly redirect the conversation back to his plans, dismissing her dreams as idealistic or unrealistic. The subtle put-downs were delivered with a smile and couched as caring concern, but they revealed Clarke's fundamental inability to see Chelsea as an independent person rather than an extension of himself. They arrived at the cabin around 6 p.m., joining a group that was already well into the celebration. The other guests welcomed them warmly, particularly Chelsea, whom many of them had come to respect and admire during their time at Westridge. She was known as someone who was brilliant but humble, kind but not naive, strong but not aggressive, qualities that stood in stark contrast to Clarke's more dominating personality. Several of the other women at the party, including Madison herself, had privately expressed concern about Chelsea's relationship with Clarke, sensing something unhealthy about his need to control and dominate every interaction. The first evening passed without major incident, though careful observers noted subtle signs of tension between Chelsea and Clarke that suggested trouble beneath the surface. Clarke dominated group conversations in his usual manner, but Chelsea seemed more withdrawn than usual, participating less in discussions and spending more time listening than speaking. When someone asked her about her summer internship with a civil rights organization, Clarke answered for her, describing it as a little hobby project that was keeping her busy. The dismissive tone wasn't lost on the other guests, several of whom exchanged uncomfortable glances at the casual way Clarke minimized something that was clearly important to Chelsea. But the most telling moment came late that evening when the group was sitting around the fireplace sharing stories about their college experiences. Someone asked Chelsea about her hometown and family, a seemingly innocent question that caused her to tense visibly. Before she could answer, Clarke jumped in with a detailed story about her background that was clearly fabricated, describing a loving family and idyllic childhood that everyone who knew Chelsea suspected wasn't accurate. The fact that he was lying wasn't as disturbing as the way he was lying, speaking with complete confidence about experiences that weren't his to share, treating Chelsea's personal history as something he had the right to control and manipulate. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the outdoor activities Madison had planned. The group started with a hike around the lake, about a 3-mile loop trail that offered spectacular views and plenty of opportunities for the kind of philosophical discussions that Westridge students loved. Chelsea seemed more relaxed away from the cabin's social pressures, engaging more naturally with the other hikers and even laughing at jokes, something several people noted they hadn't seen her do much lately. But Clarke's behavior during the hike was increasingly concerning. He was more aggressive than usual in political discussions, shutting down opposing viewpoints with a harshness that made everyone uncomfortable. When someone disagreed with his position on a controversial topic, he didn't engage in the intellectual sparring that was typical of Westridge students. He attacked their intelligence and qualifications to have an opinion, creating an atmosphere of tension that dampened everyone's mood. Several hikers began deliberately engaging with Chelsea instead of Clarke, recognizing that she was more willing to listen to different perspectives and engage in genuine dialogue. The most disturbing incident occurred when Chelsea stopped to take photos of wildflowers along the trail, causing the group to pause while she captured images that she planned to send to her mentor, Professor Holbrook, who was an amateur botanist. Clarke's impatience was immediately obvious, and when Chelsea didn't respond quickly enough to his demands that she hurry up, he grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her away from the flowers. The gesture was brief but unmistakably aggressive, and several witnesses saw Chelsea's face flush with embarrassment and what looked like fear. "Come on, we're holding everyone up," Kirk said loudly, his voice carrying a tone of authority that assumed he had the right to control Chelsea's behavior. But what bothered the other hikers wasn't just his impatience. It was the way Chelsea immediately apologized and hurried to catch up, like someone who was accustomed to walking on eggshells around their partner. The incident lasted less than a minute, but it revealed dynamics in their relationship that made several people deeply uncomfortable. The afternoon was spent swimming and sunbathing, with most of the group lounging on the deck while others enjoyed the lake's clear, cool water. Chelsea was a strong swimmer, and she seemed to find peace in the water, swimming laps while the others socialized. But even the simple pleasure became a source of tension when Kirk began timing her laps and making comments about her technique, treating her recreational swimming as a performance that he had the right to critique and control. Around 4 p.m., the tension between Chelsea and Kirk reached a breaking point over something that seemed trivial but revealed deeper issues in their relationship. Chelsea had been talking with Sarah Kim, her roommate and one of her closest friends, about plans for the following weekend when Sarah mentioned that she had an extra ticket to a lecture by a prominent civil rights attorney that she thought Chelsea would enjoy. Chelsea's face lit up with excitement. This was exactly the kind of professional development opportunity she was passionate about. But Kirk immediately shut down the conversation. Chelsea's going to be busy next weekend, he announced, speaking as if she weren't sitting right next to him. We're having dinner with my parents, remember? The problem was that this was the first Chelsea had heard of any dinner plans, and the way Kirk presented it made it clear that her attendance wasn't a request but an expectation. When Chelsea gently pointed out that she hadn't agreed to dinner plans, Kirk's response revealed the controlling nature that he usually kept hidden beneath his charming exterior. I already told them you'd be there, he said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone within earshot uncomfortable. You can't just change plans at the last minute because something more interesting comes up. The implication was clear. Her interests and aspirations were less important than his family obligations, and she didn't have the right to make independent decisions about her own time. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense, with Chelsea attempting to assert her independence while Kirk became increasingly aggressive about his expectation of control. Other guests began finding excuses to move away from the immediate area, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something private and potentially dangerous. The argument ended with Chelsea backing down and agreeing to skip the lecture, but the damage to their relationship was clearly significant. For the rest of the afternoon, they barely spoke to each other, and the tension between them cast a shadow over the entire group's mood. But what none of the witnesses knew was that Kirk's controlling behavior that afternoon wasn't just about dinner plans or lectures. It was about something much more fundamental and dangerous.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Earlier that day, while Chelsea was in the shower, Kirk had gone through her belongings with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a criminal investigation. He had been doing this for months, driven by a paranoid need to uncover what he sensed were secrets in Chelsea's past. But that morning his search had finally yielded the revelation that would transform his obsession into deadly rage. Hidden in the zippered compartment of Chelsea's purse was a small, worn photograph that would change everything. The picture showed a younger Chelsea, taken several years before her transition, displaying the masculine features that hormone therapy and time had softened into the beautiful woman Kirk had fallen for. To most people, it would have been meaningless, just an old photograph of someone who looked vaguely familiar. But to Kirk, who had become expert at reading faces and detecting deception through his political training, the truth was immediately and devastatingly clear. The woman he had been dating for 8 months, the woman he had introduced to his political mentors and fellow student leaders, the woman he had been planning a future with, had been born male. In Kirk's narcissistic and transphobic mindset, this wasn't just a revelation about Chelsea's past. It was a fundamental betrayal of everything he thought he knew about their relationship, his own sexuality, and his carefully constructed public image. Kirk's initial reaction to discovering the photograph wasn't anger. It was a cold, calculating rage that was far more dangerous than emotional outburst would have been. He sat on the bed for nearly an hour, staring at the picture and methodically working through the implications of what he had learned. In his mind, Chelsea's failure to disclose her transgender identity wasn't about her right to privacy or safety. It was about how her deception reflected on him. What would people think if they knew? What would it mean for his political ambitions if this information became public? How could he have been so blind, so easily fooled by someone he now saw as fundamentally dishonest? But perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Clarke's thoughts turned to punishment rather than understanding. Instead of trying to process his feelings or consider Chelsea's perspective, he immediately began planning how to hurt her in the most devastating way possible. His knowledge of her transgender identity wasn't just information. It was a weapon that he could use to destroy her social standing, her sense of safety, and her ability to live authentically in the world she had worked so hard to build at Westridge. The psychological transformation that occurred in Clarke during those 60 minutes was chilling in its completeness. The man who had claimed to love Chelsea, who had spoken about building a future together, who had seemed capable of genuine affection, revealed himself to be something much darker. A predator who had been unconsciously waiting for the right moment to destroy the person he claimed to care about. His love had never been about Chelsea as a person. It had been about ownership, control, and the satisfaction of possessing something beautiful and intelligent that reflected well on his own superiority. By the time Chelsea emerged from the shower, Clarke had made his decision. He wouldn't confront her immediately. That would be too simple, too clean. Instead, he would wait until the perfect moment, when he could maximize her humiliation and demonstrate his power over her in front of an audience. The birthday celebration that evening would provide the ideal setting for the psychological destruction he was planning. A public execution of Chelsea's dignity that would serve as both punishment for her deception and warning to anyone else who might consider crossing him. The rest of Saturday afternoon passed in a haze of Clarke's careful psychological manipulation, as he laid the groundwork for the evening's events while maintaining the facade of a loving boyfriend. He was particularly attentive to Chelsea in front of the other guests, touching her frequently and making affectionate comments that seemed romantic but were actually designed to establish possession and control. To outside observers, he appeared to be the perfect boyfriend, but those who knew him well noticed an intensity in his behavior that suggested something was building beneath the surface. Chelsea, meanwhile, was struggling with her own instincts about Clarke's changing behavior. Something felt different about him that day, something predatory and dangerous that triggered every survival instinct she had developed during her years of living as a transgender woman. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but she found herself becoming increasingly anxious as the day progressed, jumping at unexpected sounds and feeling constantly on edge in ways that reminded her of the hypervigilance she had experienced during her early transition years. Around 7 p.m., as the group began preparing for the evening's birthday celebration, Chelsea made a decision that might have saved her life if she had followed through with it. She approached Madison and quietly asked if she could speak with her privately, explaining that she wasn't feeling well and was considering leaving early. Madison immediately offered to drive her back to campus, recognizing that something was seriously wrong. But before they could finalize the plan, Clarke appeared and inserted himself into their conversation. "Everything okay, babe?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of possessive concern that made Madison uncomfortable. When Chelsea explained that she was thinking about leaving early, Clarke's response was swift and decisive. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, wrapping his arm around her in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt restrictive. "It's Madison's birthday. We can't leave early." The way he said "we" made it clear that Chelsea's desires weren't part of the equation. He had made the decision for both of them. Madison later reported that she had never seen Chelsea look as frightened as she did in that moment, trapped between her desire to leave and Clarke's obvious expectation that she would comply with his wishes. The brief conversation ended with Chelsea agreeing to stay, but Madison could see that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between the couple. What she was witnessing wasn't a loving relationship, but something much more sinister. A psychological prison where Chelsea's autonomy had been systematically stripped away until she no longer felt capable of making independent decisions. The birthday party that evening started like any other college celebration: music, drinking, and the kind of conversations that only happen when young people feel free from adult supervision. Madison had decorated the cabin's main room with balloons and streamers, creating a festive atmosphere that should have been perfect for celebrating another year of life and the friendships that had sustained them through their college years. The other guests were in high spirits, looking forward to a night of fun and relaxation before returning to the academic pressures that awaited them on campus. But those who were paying attention noticed that Clarke's behavior had become increasingly erratic as the evening progressed. He was drinking heavily, much more than his usual careful consumption, and his interactions with other guests had taken on an aggressive edge that made people uncomfortable. When someone disagreed with his political opinions, he didn't engage in his usual intellectual sparring. He attacked their character and intelligence with a viciousness that seemed completely disproportionate to the disagreement. Most concerning was his treatment of Chelsea, which had shifted from possessive affection to barely concealed hostility. He contradicted almost everything she said, corrected her when she expressed opinions, and made subtle but cutting remarks about her appearance and intelligence that left her visibly shaken. The other guests began to notice the dynamic, with several people attempting to engage Chelsea in conversations that excluded Clarke, recognizing that she seemed more comfortable when she wasn't under his direct scrutiny. Around 9 p.m., the evening took a decisive turn toward catastrophe when Clarke announced that he needed to retrieve something from their bedroom and asked Chelsea to accompany him. The request seemed innocent enough to outside observers, but Chelsea's immediate tension suggested that she understood the danger she was walking into. Several friends offered to come with them or suggested that Clarke could handle whatever he needed alone, but he insisted that Chelsea's presence was necessary, speaking with the kind of authority that brooked no disagreement. What happened in that bedroom over the next 30 minutes would be reconstructed later from the testimony of witnesses who overheard the confrontation through the walls and from physical evidence that painted a horrifying picture of psychological abuse escalating toward deadly violence. The confrontation began with Clarke producing the photograph he had found earlier, holding it up like a prosecutor presenting evidence of a crime and demanding that Chelsea explain why she had lied to him about who she really was. Chelsea's initial response was reportedly one of terror rather than surprise. She immediately understood not just that her secret had been discovered, but that she was alone with someone whose psychological stability had clearly deteriorated beyond any hope of rational discussion. Her attempts to explain that her transgender identity was part of her past that didn't define who she was now fell on ears that were completely closed to anything resembling empathy or understanding. The verbal assault that followed was so vicious and dehumanizing that several witnesses later required counseling to process what they had overheard. Clarke systematically attacked every aspect of Chelsea's identity, using language that was deliberately chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. He described her as a freak, a predator, and a sick pervert who had tricked him into a relationship through deception and manipulation. He threatened to expose her to the entire university, to contact her professors and future employers, to ensure that everyone she cared about knew what he now characterized as her shameful secret. But perhaps most disturbing was the way Clarke framed Chelsea's transgender identity not as a personal characteristic, but as a deliberate attack on him. In his narcissistic worldview, her failure to disclose her history wasn't about her right to privacy. It was about her supposedly malicious intent to embarrass and humiliate him. He spoke about feeling violated and assaulted by her deception, using language typically reserved for actual victims of crime to describe his own wounded ego and damaged self-image. The psychological abuse continued for nearly 30 minutes, during which Clarke systematically destroyed Chelsea's sense of self-worth, while the other party guests listened in horror from the main room. Several people approached the bedroom door multiple times, torn between their desire to intervene and their fear of Clarke's increasingly unstable behavior. The sounds coming from the room, furniture being thrown, Chelsea pleading for him to calm down, Clarke's voice becoming increasingly loud and threatening, made it clear that the situation was escalating beyond verbal abuse toward potential physical violence. Around 9:45 p.m., the confrontation reached a tipping point when other guests finally began knocking on the bedroom door, demanding to know if everything was okay and making it clear that they weren't going to continue ignoring what was happening. This outside pressure forced Clarke to make a choice that would determine the trajectory of the rest of the evening. He could end the confrontation privately and deal with Chelsea later, or he could take his psychological assault public in a way that would maximize her humiliation while demonstrating his power over her to an audience.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Clarke chose the latter option, dragging Chelsea out of the bedroom and into the main living area where 20 other students were gathered for what had been a birthday celebration. What happened next would be seared into the memories of everyone present, creating the collective trauma that would later manifest as their claimed amnesia. In front of the entire group, Clarke announced that Chelsea was transgender, using language that was deliberately cruel and designed to maximize her humiliation while establishing his own position as the victim of her deception. The announcement itself was devastating enough, but Clarke didn't stop there. He proceeded to describe intimate details of their relationship in ways that violated every boundary of privacy and human decency, painting Chelsea as a predator who had deliberately deceived him about her true identity. He spoke about their physical relationship in graphic terms that were clearly intended to humiliate Chelsea while positioning himself as someone who had been sexually assaulted through deception. The reaction from the group was immediate and painfully divided, revealing fault lines in their supposedly progressive community that many of them had never acknowledged or confronted. About half of the students, led by Chelsea's closest friends Sarah Kim and Marcus Webb, immediately rallied to her defense, condemning Clarke's behavior and attempting to provide comfort and support to someone who was clearly in psychological crisis. They recognized that regardless of their personal feelings about transgender issues, what they were witnessing was emotional abuse that was completely unacceptable. But the other half of the group, influenced by alcohol, Clarke's charismatic leadership, and their own buried prejudices, began to turn against Chelsea in ways that revealed the depth of transphobia that still existed even among educated, supposedly progressive young people. Some expressed anger at what they characterized as Chelsea's deception. Others questioned whether her presence in women's spaces at the university was appropriate, and a few even suggested that Clarke's reaction was understandable given the circumstances. The party devolved into something resembling a trial, with Chelsea forced to defend her right to exist as her authentic self while Clarke played prosecutor, judge, and jury. Those who supported her found themselves outnumbered and increasingly intimidated by the growing hostility in the room, while those who opposed her became emboldened by Clarke's leadership and the group dynamics that were rapidly spiraling out of control. What had started as a birthday celebration had become a lynch mob, with Chelsea trapped at the center of a psychological vortex that was spinning toward violence. The arguments that followed revealed the complex and often contradictory attitudes that even progressive young people held about transgender identity and rights. Some students who generally supported LGBTQ+ equality found themselves struggling with questions about disclosure and consent that they had never seriously considered. Others, who had always seen themselves as allies, discovered prejudices and fears that they hadn't known they possessed. The alcohol and group dynamics amplified these feelings, creating an atmosphere where rational discussion became impossible and mob mentality took over. Chelsea's few defenders found themselves fighting a losing battle against Clarke's manipulation and the crowd's growing hostility. Sarah Kim made an impassioned speech about accepting people for who they are rather than judging them for their past. But her words were drowned out by angry voices demanding to know what other lies Chelsea had told. Marcus Webb attempted to point out that Chelsea's transgender identity was private medical information that she had every right to keep confidential, but he was shouted down by people who claimed that her deception invalidated any right to privacy. Most disturbing was how quickly some of Chelsea's supposed friends turned against her once her transgender identity was revealed. People who had known and respected her for years suddenly began questioning everything about their relationships with her, as if her transgender identity retroactively negated every conversation they had shared, every moment of friendship they had experienced, every reason they had found to value her as a person. The speed and completeness of their rejection revealed how shallow their acceptance had actually been, how conditional their friendship was on her conforming to their expectations of what a real woman should be. Around 11 p.m., as the confrontation showed no signs of cooling down and actually seemed to be escalating toward potential physical violence, Chelsea made the decision that would ultimately cost her life. Recognizing that the situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of resolution and that staying at the cabin would only expose her to further psychological torture, she announced that she was leaving immediately and would find her own way back to campus. The decision to leave was the right one. Staying would have certainly meant more hours of psychological abuse and possible physical violence. But Chelsea made one crucial mistake that sealed her fate. She refused the offers from several friends to accompany her, insisting that she could handle the situation alone and didn't want to ruin anyone else's weekend. Her concern for others, even in her moment of greatest need, reflected the kind of selfless character that had made her beloved by those who truly knew her, but it also left her vulnerable to Kirk's final, deadly assault.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
As Chelsea gathered her belongings and headed for the door, Kirk followed her outside, continuing his verbal assault on the cabin's back deck, where the overhead lights created a small circle of visibility in the darkness beyond. The argument that ensued was overheard by everyone inside the cabin, but what happened next occurred in the shadows beyond the deck lights, where witnesses could hear voices raised in anger and fear, but couldn't see the physical confrontation that was taking place. The sounds that carried back to the cabin told a story of escalating violence that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. First came the noise of a struggle, furniture being knocked over, footsteps running across wooden decking, voices raised in desperation and rage. Then came Chelsea's voice, calling out for help with an urgency that made it clear she was fighting for her life. Finally came a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the violence that had preceded it. A silence that stretched for minutes while the witnesses inside the cabin sat frozen with the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. When several students finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found blood on the deck and a clear trail leading into the forest, but no sign of either Chelsea or Kirk. The amount of blood was significant enough to indicate serious injury, and the trail disappeared into dense woods where visibility was nearly zero. Several people called out Chelsea's name, but the only response was silence that seemed to swallow their voices like a living thing. The group's decision to wait until morning to call for help would later be identified as one of the most crucial failures in the entire case. Instead of immediately contacting police and organizing a search party, they convinced themselves that Chelsea and Kirk had simply continued their argument elsewhere and would return when they cooled down. This decision wasn't based on rational assessment of the evidence. The blood trail made it clear that someone had been seriously injured, but on their desire to avoid the consequences of involving authorities in what they hoped was still a private matter. But their inaction wasn't entirely about avoiding trouble with police or university administrators. As investigators would later discover, several witnesses had seen and heard enough to understand that a serious crime had likely been committed, and their failure to act immediately was motivated by a calculated decision to protect their own futures rather than potentially save Chelsea's life. They were more concerned about their reputations, their academic standing, and their post-graduation prospects than they were about the possibility that someone they knew was dying alone in the woods. The 8 hours between Chelsea's disappearance and the discovery of her body the next morning represented a critical window during which she might have been saved if anyone had shown the courage to act on what they knew rather than what they hoped. Emergency responders later estimated that Chelsea lived for several hours after the initial attack, meaning that immediate medical intervention might have prevented her death. Instead, she died alone in the darkness while 23 people who could have helped chose to prioritize their own comfort over her life. Kirk's behavior during those 8 hours was as calculated and manipulative as everything else about his assault on Chelsea. Rather than fleeing the scene in panic, which would have been the natural response of someone who had committed a crime of passion, he methodically worked to cover his tracks and manipulate the remaining witnesses into silence. He returned to the cabin several times during the night, each time providing different explanations for Chelsea's absence and gradually building a narrative that painted her as unstable and potentially dangerous. In his first return, around midnight, Kirk claimed that Chelsea had attacked him and then fled into the woods when he defended himself. He showed the other students scratches on his arms and face that he said were from her fingernails, conveniently ignoring the fact that the blood evidence suggested a much more serious altercation than defensive scratches would produce. His story was designed to plant seeds of doubt about Chelsea's mental state while positioning himself as the victim of her supposed violence. His second return, around 2 a.m., introduced new elements to his narrative that were clearly designed to justify whatever had happened in the woods. He claimed that Chelsea had threatened to kill herself rather than face the shame of having her transgender identity exposed, and that she had become increasingly unhinged as the evening progressed. He described finding disturbing items in her belongings, items that were never discovered by investigators, and suggested that her reaction to being found out proved that she was capable of anything. The most chilling aspect of Clarke's manipulation was how effectively he turned the group's guilt about their treatment of Chelsea into a weapon that ensured their silence. He reminded them that they had all participated in the confrontation that drove her into the woods, that their words and actions had contributed to her distressed state, and that involving police would inevitably expose their own culpability in whatever had happened. He framed their silence not as protecting him, but as protecting themselves and Chelsea's memory from further humiliation. By dawn, Clarke had successfully convinced most of the witnesses that Chelsea's disappearance was the result of a tragic accident or suicide brought on by her shame at being exposed, and that their best course of action was to maintain silence about the events leading up to her disappearance. He had transformed a room full of potential witnesses into accomplices, using their guilt, fear, and self-interest to ensure that the truth about his actions would never emerge. But Clarke had made one crucial mistake in his attempt to control the narrative and cover up his crime. In his narcissistic arrogance, he had assumed that Chelsea was as naive about technology and personal safety as she had been trusting about people. What he didn't know was that Chelsea had been documenting their relationship for weeks, using her smartphone to record their arguments and conversations as a way of protecting herself from what she was beginning to recognize as escalating psychological abuse. The voice memo that would ultimately solve the case and expose Clarke's lies was recorded during their final confrontation in the bedroom, capturing not just his verbal abuse and explicit threats of violence, but also Chelsea's own voice speaking directly to her phone during a brief moment when Clarke had stepped away to get another drink. Her words, spoken with the clarity of someone who understood the mortal danger she was in, would become the most damning evidence against Clarke Densley and the key to understanding the true horror of what had occurred that night. "If anything happens to me tonight, it started with Clarke," her voice said, barely above a whisper but clearly audible on the recording. "I'm scared. I don't think I'm going to make it out of here alive. He found out about my past, and he's not the person I thought he was. He's talking about hurting me, about making me pay for lying to him. If something happens, please remember that I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to live my life as myself." The recording continued for another several minutes, capturing Clarke's return to the room and the escalation of his threats from psychological abuse to explicit promises of physical violence. His voice, distorted by alcohol and rage, laid out in chilling detail exactly what he planned to do to Chelsea as punishment for what he saw as her deception. The audio quality was clear enough that investigators would later be able to use voice analysis technology to confirm Clarke's identity, making his denials impossible to maintain. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the recording was Chelsea's final words, spoken as Clarke dragged her from the bedroom toward what would become her death. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the phone. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell the truth earlier. I'm sorry I brought this into all of your lives. If I don't make it through tonight, please know that I loved you all, and I hope someday the world will be safer for people like me." The discovery of this recording 3 days after Chelsea's murder would transform the investigation from a complex case with multiple suspects and unclear motives into a straightforward prosecution of a killer whose own words had condemned him. But it would also expose something equally disturbing about the other witnesses: the extent to which they had chosen silence over justice, protecting their own futures at the expense of Chelsea's memory and her family's right to know the truth about her death. When Chelsea's body was finally discovered by the morning jogger at 6:47 a.m., the scene painted a horrifying picture of her final moments that contradicted every element of Clarke's carefully constructed narrative. She hadn't committed suicide in shame over being exposed. She had been brutally murdered by someone who had chased her through the woods like a predator hunting prey. The injuries to her body indicated a prolonged struggle, suggesting that she had fought desperately for her life before succumbing to wounds that were clearly inflicted by another person. The medical examiner's report would later confirm what the crime scene evidence suggested. Chelsea had been beaten and stabbed multiple times, suffering injuries that were completely inconsistent with suicide or accidental death. The pattern of wounds indicated that her attacker had continued the assault even after she was incapacitated, suggesting a level of rage and hatred that went far beyond what would be necessary to simply silence a victim. This was a murder driven by pure malice, committed by someone who wanted Chelsea to suffer as much as possible before she died. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the defensive wounds on Chelsea's hands and arms, which indicated that she had fought back against her attacker with desperate courage. Under her fingernails, investigators found skin and blood that would later be matched to Clarke through DNA analysis, providing irrefutable proof that he had been present during her final moments and had been the target of her attempts to defend herself. The investigation that followed Chelsea's murder would reveal layers of deception and complicity that extended far beyond Clarke's individual actions. As detectives began interviewing the witnesses from the cabin, they quickly realized that the claimed amnesia was a coordinated lie designed to protect not just Clarke, but the entire group from consequences that could derail their carefully planned futures. These weren't traumatized victims struggling with fragmented memories. They were calculating individuals who had made a conscious decision to prioritize their own interests over justice for a murdered friend.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The first crack in their coordinated silence came from Sarah Kim, Chelsea's black roommate and closest friend, who had been struggling with guilt and horror over her failure to protect someone she loved. 3 days after the murder, unable to sleep or eat, and haunted by nightmares about Chelsea's final moments, Sarah contacted investigators and revealed that she possessed information that could solve the case. Her decision to come forward wasn't motivated by civic duty or respect for law enforcement. It was driven by the realization that remaining silent made her complicit in her best friend's murder. Sarah's testimony revealed the true extent of Clarke's manipulation and the witness's cowardice, painting a picture of the birthday celebration that bore no resemblance to the innocent gathering they had initially described. She confirmed that Clarke had publicly humiliated Chelsea, that the entire group had witnessed her psychological torture, and that several people had heard sounds of violence from the woods but had chosen not to investigate or call for help. But Sarah's most devastating revelation concerned the hours immediately following Chelsea's disappearance, when Clarke had systematically worked to ensure the group's silence through a combination of manipulation, threats, and appeals to their self-interest. She described how he had convinced them that calling police would ruin all of their futures, that Chelsea's death would be seen as suicide regardless of what they reported, and that their only choice was to maintain a united front of ignorance about the events leading up to her disappearance. "He made us all feel like we were guilty too," Sarah explained through tears. "He kept saying that we had all participated in driving Chelsea away, that our words had contributed to whatever happened to her. He made it seem like we were protecting ourselves, not him. But I realize now that we were protecting a killer, and Chelsea died because we were too cowardly to do the right thing." Sarah's cooperation provided investigators with the leverage they needed to break down the other witnesses' coordinated lies. Faced with evidence that their amnesia claims were false, and that at least one of their co-conspirators was willing to testify truthfully, several other students began providing more honest accounts of what they had witnessed that night. Each new testimony added details to the emerging picture of Clarke's systematic psychological torture of Chelsea and the group's collective failure to intervene when her life was in danger. The testimony that would prove most damaging to Clarke came from Marcus Webb, Chelsea's black friend from the law program, who had been one of her most vocal defenders during the confrontation at the cabin. Marcus revealed that he had actually followed Clarke and Chelsea outside during their final argument, positioning himself where he could overhear their conversation while remaining hidden in the shadows beyond the deck lights. What Marcus had witnessed contradicted every element of Clarke's self-defense claims and exposed the true nature of what had occurred in those woods. According to his testimony, Clarke had continued his verbal assault on Chelsea even after they were outside, becoming increasingly explicit about his intentions to hurt her physically. When Chelsea had attempted to leave, walking toward her car with the intention of driving back to campus, Clarke had pursued her, grabbing her arm and forcing her toward the tree line where visibility would be limited. "I heard her begging him to let her go," Marcus testified. "She kept saying she was sorry, that she never meant to hurt him, that she just wanted to leave peacefully. But he wasn't listening to her. He was talking about making her pay, about teaching her a lesson she'd never forget. When she tried to break free and run toward the cars, he tackled her and dragged her into the woods. I heard her screaming for help, and then everything went quiet." Marcus's failure to intervene during those crucial moments would haunt him for the rest of his life, but his testimony provided investigators with the eyewitness account they needed to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to Chelsea's murder. His description of Clarke's behavior revealed someone who was completely in control of his actions, systematically pursuing and attacking a victim who posed no threat to him. This wasn't a crime of passion or self-defense. It was premeditated murder carried out by someone who felt entitled to punish Chelsea for failing to meet his expectations. But perhaps the most shocking revelation in the case came during the interrogation of Madison Torres, the birthday girl whose celebration had been transformed into the setting for Chelsea's murder. Under intense questioning from investigators who had grown increasingly suspicious of her claims of ignorance, Madison finally broke down and revealed a truth that shattered any remaining illusions about the innocent witnesses who had claimed to remember nothing about that night. The coordination of their silence hadn't been Clarke's idea alone. It had been a group decision made by students who understood that their participation in Chelsea's psychological torture could expose them to criminal liability and social consequences that could destroy their carefully planned futures. They hadn't just witnessed Clarke's abuse of Chelsea, many of them had actively participated in it, cheering his verbal assault, blocking exits when she tried to leave earlier in the evening, and even following them outside to watch the final confrontation. "We knew what was happening," Madison admitted through tears. "We all knew that Clarke was going to hurt her, and we let it happen because we were angry at her for lying to us about who she was. Some people were saying she deserved whatever happened to her for deceiving us all. Others were talking about how this would teach other trans people not to try to trick normal students. We weren't innocent bystanders. We were part of a mob that wanted to see her punished." Madison's revelation that several witnesses had actually followed Clarke and Chelsea into the woods, positioning themselves where they could watch the assault while maintaining plausible deniability about their presence, transformed the case from a murder with passive witnesses into something resembling a lynching with active participants. The investigation revealed that at least 6 students had been close enough to intervene during Chelsea's murder, but had chosen instead to watch her die, treating her final moments as entertainment rather than tragedy. The discovery of cell phone videos taken by some of these witnesses provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the true horror of what had occurred that night. Multiple students had recorded portions of Clarke's assault on Chelsea, capturing both the physical violence and their own reactions to watching someone they knew being beaten to death. The videos revealed a group of young people who were laughing, cheering, and making jokes while a human being suffered and died in front of them. The existence of these videos, which the witnesses had initially denied taking, demonstrated the premeditated nature of their cover-up and their understanding that they had participated in something criminal. They had systematically deleted the footage from their phones and social media accounts, but investigators were able to recover the files from cloud storage and deleted data caches. The recovered videos would provide irrefutable evidence of their complicity and ensure that they faced appropriate criminal charges for their roles in Chelsea's death. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, investigators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented in their experience. A murder that had been committed not just by an individual killer, but by a group of supposedly educated, progressive young people who had collectively decided that Chelsea's life was worth less than their own comfort and convenience. The case would ultimately result in charges against not just Clarke, but 15 other students who had participated in various aspects of the crime and its cover-up. Clarke Densley's arrest came 4 days after Chelsea's murder, as investigators closed in on him with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He had spent those days attempting to establish an alibi and distance himself from the crime scene, but the combination of DNA evidence, witness testimony, and Chelsea's own recorded words had made his guilt impossible to deny. When officers approached him at his off-campus apartment, he was in the process of destroying evidence and preparing to flee the state, demonstrating consciousness of guilt that would later be used against him in court. His initial response to arrest was characteristic of his narcissistic personality. He immediately began trying to manipulate the officers, claiming that he was the real victim and that Chelsea had somehow brought her death upon herself through her deception and mental instability. He showed no remorse for her death, no empathy for her suffering, and no understanding that his actions had been anything other than justified responses to what he characterized as her betrayal. The interrogation that followed revealed the full extent of Clarke's psychological disturbance and his complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions. He continued to maintain that Chelsea's murder had been self-defense, claiming that she had attacked him with a knife and that he had only used force to protect himself. When investigators pointed out that no weapon had been found near Chelsea's body and that her injuries were clearly inflicted by an attacker rather than sustained during mutual combat, Clarke simply adjusted his story, claiming that she must have disposed of the weapon before he was forced to defend himself. Most disturbing was Clarke's apparent belief that he deserved sympathy and understanding for what he characterized as his own victimization. He spoke about feeling violated and assaulted by Chelsea's failure to disclose her transgender identity, using language that revealed his fundamental inability to see her as a human being deserving of basic respect and dignity. In his mind, her death wasn't a tragedy but a logical consequence of her own actions, and the real injustice was that he was being prosecuted for defending himself against what he saw as sexual assault through deception. The trial that followed would become a landmark case in the prosecution of hate crimes and the legal recognition of transgender victims' rights. Clarke was ultimately convicted on multiple charges including first-degree murder, hate crime enhancements, and tampering with evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict, influenced by the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the particularly cruel nature of the crime. Clarke's sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole reflected not just the severity of his crime, but also the court's recognition that he posed an ongoing danger to society. The judge noted during sentencing that Clarke had shown no remorse for his actions, no understanding of the impact of his crime on Chelsea's family and the wider community, and no indication that he could ever be safely released into society. The other students involved in the crime and cover-up faced a range of charges depending on their level of participation. Those who had actively participated in the assault or had recorded videos of Chelsea's murder received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in prison. Others who had simply maintained silence about what they witnessed received lesser sentences, but all faced consequences that would impact their futures in ways they had never imagined when they made the decision to prioritize their own interests over justice for Chelsea. The impact of Chelsea's murder extended far beyond the courtroom, sparking national conversations about transgender rights, hate crimes, and the responsibilities of bystanders when witnessing violence. Her death became a rallying point for advocates seeking stronger protections for transgender individuals and more comprehensive hate crime legislation. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by transgender college students and the need for better support systems and safety measures on university campuses. Westridge University itself faced significant scrutiny and criticism for its handling of the case and its failure to adequately protect transgender students. The investigation revealed that there had been previous complaints about Clarke's aggressive behavior that had been ignored or inadequately addressed by university administrators. The school was forced to implement comprehensive reforms to its policies regarding discrimination, harassment, and campus safety. Though critics argued that these changes came too late to save Chelsea's life, Chelsea's family, who had been estranged from her since her transition, were forced to confront their own prejudices and regrets in the wake of her murder. Her parents, who had refused to speak to her for 3 years, publicly acknowledged their mistakes and became advocates for transgender rights and family acceptance. Their transformation from rejection to advocacy represented one of the few positive outcomes of an otherwise unmitigated tragedy. The establishment of the Chelsea Clarke Foundation for Transgender Safety became their way of honoring their daughter's memory while working to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. The foundation provides support services for transgender college students, funds research into anti-transgender violence, and advocates for policy changes to better protect vulnerable individuals from hate-motivated crimes. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, Chelsea's mentor and one of the few people who had known about her transgender identity, became a leading voice in the academic community calling for better support systems for transgender students. She established a scholarship program in Chelsea's name and worked to develop training programs for faculty and staff to better recognize and respond to signs of discrimination and abuse targeting transgender individuals. The ripple effects of Chelsea's murder continue to be felt years later, as her case is studied in law schools, cited in court decisions, and referenced in policy discussions about transgender rights and hate crime legislation. Her death became a catalyst for change, though those who loved her would trade all the progress in the world for the chance to have her back, to hear her laugh again, to watch her fulfill the dreams that were stolen from her in those dark woods beside Sunset Lake. The cabin where Chelsea died has been demolished, the site now marked by a small memorial garden where visitors can reflect on the cost of hatred and the importance of standing up for those who are vulnerable and marginalized. The memorial includes a quote from one of Chelsea's law school essays: "Justice delayed is justice denied, but silence in the face of injustice is complicity in evil." These words, written by a young woman who believed deeply in the power of law to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, serve as a reminder of what the world lost when Chelsea Clarke's life was cut short. She would have been a formidable advocate for civil rights, a brilliant legal mind capable of changing laws and protecting others who faced the kind of discrimination and violence that ultimately claimed her life. The students who participated in her murder, and those who remained silent in its aftermath, were forced to live with the knowledge that their actions had contributed to the death of someone who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Some expressed genuine remorse and worked to make amends through advocacy and service, while others continued to minimize their culpability and focus on their own victimization by the legal system. Clarke Densley remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life unless he can successfully appeal his conviction. Reports from correctional staff indicate that he continues to show no remorse for his crime and maintains his belief that he was the real victim of Chelsea's deception. His complete lack of empathy and continued adherence to his delusional narrative suggest that the judge was correct in determining that he could never be safely released into society. The case file for Chelsea Clarke's murder runs to thousands of pages, documenting every detail of the investigation, trial, and aftermath. But beyond the legal documents and evidence photos lies a simpler truth. Chelsea Clarke was a young woman who wanted nothing more than to live authentically, to pursue her dreams, and to make the world a better place for others who faced similar struggles. Her death was a preventable tragedy that occurred because hatred was allowed to flourish unchecked and because too many people chose silence when they should have chosen courage. Her story serves as both a warning and an inspiration, a warning about the deadly consequences of hatred and prejudice, and an inspiration to those who continue fighting for a world where everyone can live safely and authentically regardless of their gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic that makes them different from the majority. Chelsea Clarke's legacy is not just the reforms and protections that were implemented after her death, but the ongoing reminder that each of us has a responsibility to stand up for justice and protect those who cannot protect themselves. The silence that surrounded Chelsea's murder, the silence of witnesses who chose not to act, the silence of friends who chose not to speak, the silence of a society that often ignores anti-transgender violence, was as deadly as the weapon that ended her life. Her death teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality but complicity, and that our failure to act when others are in danger makes us partially responsible for the consequences. In the end, Chelsea Clarke died not just because Clarke Densley was a killer, but because 23 other people chose their own comfort over her life, because a university failed to adequately protect its students, and because a society still struggles to accept and protect those who dare to live as their authentic selves. Her death was the product of individual evil enabled by collective indifference, and her legacy is the ongoing fight to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. The last entry in Chelsea's journal, found by investigators in her dorm room, provides a fitting epitaph for a life cut tragically short. "I know that living authentically means taking risks, but I refuse to hide who I am out of fear. If something happens to me, I hope people will remember that I tried to live with courage and truth, and that my death, if it comes, should inspire others to be braver than I was, to speak louder than I did, and to never let fear silence their authentic selves." These words, written just weeks before her murder, capture the essence of who Chelsea Clarke was and what she stood for. She was someone who chose authenticity over safety, truth over convenience, and courage over comfort. Her death was a tragedy that never should have happened, but her life was an inspiration that continues to motivate others to fight for justice, acceptance, and the fundamental right of all people to live as their authentic selves without fear of violence or discrimination.